Welcome to another episode of On the Issues with Alon Ben-Meir. Today's guest is Sam Ben-Meir, Assistant Adjunct Professor of Philosophy at City University of New York College of Technology. He is the author of Ethical Interanimality, Toward a Relational Philosophy of Nature, which reflects on his long-standing effort to rethink our place in nature and the vulnerabilities that bind all life together. In this episode, Alon and Sam discuss the interrelationship between humanity and nature and the ethics of that relationship. In particular, they examine how viewing ourselves as living beings among other living beings changes how we think about politics, economics, technology, and in particular, the environmental crisis.
Hi, good morning, Sam. How are you?
Great, thank you.
Oh, I was going to say sweetheart as always. I am so delighted to have you this morning, not because you're my son and I'm so proud of you, but also because what you really have to say, especially since you published your book, which is a very fascinating book. So today conversation is going to deal with a subject that I know has been very close to your heart from childhood, and which in many ways shape your life to a great extent. And so I have many questions for you. But before I start the questions, I want to first to introduce you to our listeners. So Sam Ben-Meir is an Adjunct Professor of Philosophy at City University of New York, where he teaches ethics, political philosophy, and the philosophy of technology. He is the author of Ethical Interanimality, Toward a Rational Philosophy of Nature, and has published widely on philosophy, literature, politics, religion, and environmental thoughts. His current research explores recognition, freedom, democracy, and the moral foundation of political community. What a pleasure to have you with me this morning.
It's a pleasure
And
to be
so,
here.
thank you. So I want to start with something that was actually precipitated to a great extent writing this very critical, very important book that you wrote, the story that you have experienced when you were 5 years old. Can you tell our audience about that story and how that impacted your life?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's. I suppose it's sort of an unusual way to start a book of philosophy with a autobiographical uh, episode from my early childhood, but it's also one of my earliest memories, and it was uh, in many ways a horrifying experience. It was the killing of a bird, the deliberate one. And I was with a friend, but the idea to kill a bird was mine, I have to admit. And the reason I begin the book with the preface actually with this story is because in many ways that bird has never stopped teaching me. I was 5 years old. I had a small wooden boomerang, hardly an exotic weapon, just the sort of thing a curious child might throw without thinking about it, where it would land. And one afternoon, we decided to uh, try and hit a bird, and it struck. And the bird did not die immediately. It did die, but not immediately. It fell to the ground. It was injured, and it began shrieking. It began to shriek. And what has remained, I guess, with me all these years wasn't the sight of blood, or it wasn't even the fact that I had heard it. It was the sound first, the terror in that cry. Uh, and, because until that moment, I had never really imagined that another creature experienced the world from within, as I did. And suddenly that cry made the bird's interiority, its inwardness, impossible to ignore. So I didn't, obviously I didn't possess the philosophical language to describe what had happened. I was 5 years old, and I wasn't thinking I wasn't thinking about ethics or phenomenology or ontology or any of that. I simply wept. I wept, and immediately, um, and people sometimes assume I cried because I had broken a moral rule, and I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's what happened at all. And children generally don't possess highly developed moral theories. I certainly didn't at the time. What I experienced was something very immediate. I had broken what bothered me was not that I had broken a moral rule, but that I had broken a body, and but not merely a physical body. I had broken what phenomenologists would call a live body, and you know that is, in other words, a body for whom the world mattered, and a creature whose life was organized around its own perceptions and fears and possibilities. Until that moment, the bird had existed for me largely as part of the landscape, and its cry, it's shattered that illusion. So I sometimes say that I had snapped a cord that I didn't even know existed until it broke. Only when it was broken did I discover that my life and the bird's life had never been as separate as I had imagined. And so that experience has stayed with me for more than 40 years. And I'll also say, eventually it led me to a sentence from the great 20th century philosopher Emmanuel Levinas that I think captures the moment, at least part of it, beautifully. And he writes that morality begins when freedom discovers itself to be murderous and arbitrary. And I like that line and that thought because it doesn't begin with rules. It begins with an encounter. In that moment, my freedom ceased to appear innocent. And, I discovered that I possessed the power to wound another center of experience. But I think also the experience also went in some ways beyond what Levinas is describing, because I wasn't only it wasn't only that I discovered the possibility of violence, I discovered relation. And the bird's suffering wasn't simply over there. It reverberated within me. Um, Not unlike, and I mentioned this later in the book, not unlike Melville's Captain Ahab from Moby Dick, who's
Right.
striking the whale only to discover that he's striking himself. And I came to realize that in striking that bird, I had, in a profound sense, struck myself. And that's one of the central ideas of ethical interanimality, and the world, the living world isn't a collection of separate beings, separate objects arranged side by side. It's a web of relationships within which we ourselves exist,
Yeah.
so that when we injure that web, we are never standing outside it, and we are participants in it. And so that's why the story returns in the final chapter as well. Everything the book says about biology, phenomenology, and other particular philosophers like Goethe and Uexküll and Schelling and so on, in one way or another, is an attempt to understand what happened, I guess, in that childhood afternoon. The philosophy obviously came much later, but the bird came first.
So can you further elaborate, Sam, on the interrelationship that is existed, and any entities and existence of any entity, it doesn't stand alone. It has a relationship with the environment, has a relationship with other species, animal, and certainly with a human being. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that interrelationship
Well,
between the
yeah,
various
I mean,
entities that exist. Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, this is really what the book is about, and this is, the term ethical interanimality is, I suppose, a rather unfamiliar one, and I'll just also mention, when people often hear the term or encounter the book at first, they assume it's a book about animal rights, and it's decidedly not. It's really about I think, a much bigger question, and it's what you're touching on, which is really, what does it mean to be a living thing? Uh, and that's why that's why the subtitle of the book is a relational philosophy toward a relational philosophy of nature. That's really what I'm interested in here, is what does it mean to be a living thing, and more particularly, what kind of creatures are we? And I think that modern society encourages us to think of ourselves as separate from nature, as independent individuals who happen to live in an environment. And I think that's fundamentally mistaken. Um, Obviously, we are animals. We're biological beings, but more than that, every breath we take, every meal we eat, every emotion we experience, in fact, reminds us that our lives are woven into the lives of countless other organisms. So the central argument of the book is in a way quite simple. It's that ethics begins not with abstract rules, uh, but with relationships. And, before we become citizens or consumers or voters or what have you, we are living beings among other living beings. So, obviously that may sound obvious, but once you really take it seriously, uh, I think this is my hope, is that it changes how you think about politics, economics, technology, and in particular, the environmental crisis.
So, and then of course, I mean, as I read, I must have confessed I did not finish the whole book, but
It's a
read
long,
enough
it's
to know that.
a long one. It's a heavy
I just wanted to take this a little further. That is the interconnectedness between the various beings. Yeah, right. And what is an ordinary person would like to understand, what are you talking about? What it is that they need to understand my relationship with nature. How is nature impacting me? How am I impacting nature? What is the interconnectedness between the animal, let's call it animal kingdom, and a human being? What is that interrelationship? How they interact with one another?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's exactly what I'm
I
trying
should
to
say
do.
it's almost like interdependency to some extent. That is, the
Absolutely.
wholeness of existence of each depends on the wholeness of the existence of the other, and undermining one is going to undermine the other, and we're seeing that already happening. So continue, please.
Well, I mean, I guess, I mean, there are different ways I approach this, but I think, the wager I'm making in this book is that, take the environmental crisis. It's, there are obviously many important policies we can enact, and things that we can do as individuals to mitigate what's what's unfolding all around us. Uh, but my sense is that what we need is, at a more fundamental level, is to think differently about our relationship to living things and our place in nature. And so that's why, there's you're not going to find any moral exhortation in the book. I don't propose rules or obligations of that nature. It's as I say, I think we need a different philosophy of nature is really what I'm saying. And my feeling, my sense is that if we begin to understand and we are beginning to understand the every day we're learning more about uh living, other creatures and their worlds, the worlds that they inhabit. Because every living thing is a big part of the book, and this is particularly the chapter on Jacob von Uexküll, who was an Estonian experimental biologist, but he was also a theoretical biologist and a kind of philosopher of biology. He attempted to Kantianize biology. But the point is that he had the idea that every animal has a world, it's a subject. It even down to his famous example of the tick. Even a tick has a world, and it's responding not to physical causes but to signs. And so he's also one of the fathers of biosemiotics, that animals are constantly creating and interpreting signs. And and those signs are interwoven with other animals, of course. So for him, the task of the biologist was to, in a sense, transcribe the the musical score of nature, as it were. That was his example, his analogy, I should say. Um, but yeah, I mean, what I'm trying, I guess, what I'm trying to get at is that we need to think at a more fundamental level, not just about our moral obligations and different, we can think about that from the standpoint of different moral theories, all of which is important and useful, but there is a more I think those moral theories have to be grounded in something more basic, more ontological. And that's part of the reason why I make a distinction in the book between ethics, actually, and morality.
Yeah, this
Uh,
is, this is actually what I was going to ask you, because this is one of the most intriguing questions that you in the book. What is the difference, the distinction between the two? Because most people use ethics and morality interchangeably,
sure.
that they were one. Can you elaborate on that
Yeah,
and how
no,
it's
absolutely.
applicable to your thesis in particular?
For sure, for sure. I mean, look, it's of course we use them interchangeably. Sometimes I do, and I don't think, depending on the context, sometimes it's perfectly okay. But for the purpose of my book, I think there's a useful distinction to be made, and I think there's a legitimate distinction to be made. Obviously, they're etymologically different. Ethics comes from the Greek ethos, morality comes from the Latin mores, and if we trace the idea of ethics or ethos back to its originary meaning. We could find it, I think, its earliest extent appearances in Homer, um, where but the let me say this. When people hear the word morality, they usually think of rules, like don't lie or don't steal or keep your promises and that sort of thing, treat people fairly. Or they think of moral theories, um, utilitarianism or Kantian ethics or virtue ethics or what have you. Different systems for deciding, what is right and what is wrong and what we ought to do and all that. And these are all important. I don't want to diminish them. My book isn't arguing against morality in any way, shape, or form. But what I'm asking is a different question. Before we can argue about what we ought to do, what has to be true, uh, what has to be true about the kind of beings we are for moral obligations to make sense in the first place. In other words, imagine two rocks lying beside each other, for example, right? So one rock has no duties toward the other. It cannot wrong the other. It cannot recognize it. It cannot respond to it. But nothing about two living beings. Immediately, right? An entirely different world appears. There is vulnerability, there is dependence and communication, perception and recognition. There's also the possibility of care and as I've already invoked, the possibility of injury. So my claim is that ethics begins there, not with commandments, but with a particular mode of being in the world. So the Greek word ethos, from which ethics is derived, originally referred less to a system of rules than to a way of dwelling, a manner of inhabiting the world. In fact, it refers to, as I was about to mention in Homer, to the haunts or habitats of animals. It's actually he particularly refers to the haunts of horses, of stallions. Um, so ethics in that older sense concerns the kind of beings we are before it concerns the rules we formulate. Morality, I'm suggesting, comes later. Morality is our attempt to articulate principles and laws and rights, obligations that express something about that more fundamental reality. So you might think of ethics as sometimes I think of it, I put it this way, you might think of ethics as the soil and morality as the plant that grows from it. Or so people often spend their time arguing about which plant is the healthiest, which moral theory we should adopt. I'm interested in this book in the soil, as it were, that makes any of them possible. And
Right.
that's why the book spends so much time discussing biology. The first chapter is purely the philosophy of biology, phenomenology, and our embodied existence, and so on. I'm trying to show that responsibility isn't something imposed upon us from outside, is basically the idea. It grows naturally from the kind of creatures we already are. We are always already intertwined with a myriad of other living things, and we're expressive creatures who constantly interpret one another. So, we're dependent creatures as well, who become ourselves only through relationships. Those aren't moral conclusions. They're ontological descriptions. They're descriptions about the kind of beings we are and the kind of beings living things are. And my sense is that once we understand that, morality begins to look different. Instead of asking which ethical theory should I adopt, we begin by asking, what kind of world do living beings already inhabit together? So for me, and ethics answers the first question, and morality answers the other. So I think that's ultimately why environmental politics has often struggled. Also, we've tried to persuade people through moral obligation alone, like in terms of recycle more or consume less or reduce your carbon footprint or what have you. And those are worthwhile goals, to be sure, but they can sound like a list of one more list of duties. My hope is to, in some small way, shift the conversation from obligation to belonging, so that if we truly grasp that we are participants in the living world rather than mere spectators standing outside it, then our responsibilities no longer feel externally imposed, and they arise from the recognition of who we already are.
So you would think then in that case that the narrative, I just want to dwell 2 minutes, a minute on the climate change in this particular context. So if So instead of asking, establishing rules, you should not do A, B, C, and D in order to protect the environment. You have to assume that it is for your own good, for your own self-preservation, to do certain, not to do certain things. That is to have a greater impact. Are you suggesting we have to change the narrative in terms of how we need to tackle several climate change instead of establishing rules, do and don't, versus a narrative, what's in it for you if you were to follow certain your conduct
Well,
changes?
I'm not opposed to, obviously, new policies and promoting uh, uh, this, a course of action that is going to mitigate the climate crisis in various ways by reducing methane emissions, for example. That's one very sort of low-hanging fruit that we can tackle. But it's and all that's all fine. I just don't think that can solve the problem. I think because I think there has to be a change in the way that we view nature itself. I guess is what I'm saying, is that we and not I wouldn't put it solely in terms of this is in our own interest. Of course, it's in our own interest, but more perhaps to the point is that it's that what we, and this is part of the, I think what we have lost sight of, is that uh is the intrinsic value that that living things have and that living nature has. Uh, and so, when we lose a species, the world itself is diminished. As I said, every living thing has a world. And so when we lose a species, and obviously we know that, with climate change, biodiversity is greatly threatened and is plummeting, and will only be exacerbated over the coming decades. But when we lose a species, we lose a way the world is experienced. The interiority of nature, the inwardness of nature, is that much diminished. So um so
So,
yeah,
so if I
yeah,
may,
go
if
ahead.
I may,
Go
so
ahead.
what's talking about when we talk about climate change, talk in terms of the consequence of climate change. We talk about hurricanes, we talk about wildfires, we talk about um,
Sure.
visible real changes that are taking place. But seldom you see anyone is talking about the climate change impact on the species of that. For example, take the Amazon, where perhaps tens of thousands of different species that exist. We don't even know about them much, but we probably are destroying them before even we know they exist there. Can you? So that's why I'm referring to that is we need to change the narrative in terms of the consequence of climate change, not just on the phenomena, what it's causing to human being in terms of smoke, in terms of gas emission, in terms of fires, in terms of hurricanes, but its impact on our being as such, as that's what
Yeah,
you're talking about. So that
that
is
is
we're destroying the interconnection between us and nature, as that's what you're alluding to.
absolutely, that is exactly what I'm alluding to. Yeah. And this is why I spend a good deal of time talking about vulnerability and our constitutive vulnerability and the constitutive vulnerability of all living things. And and one and so when we become fully, I think, more aware of it, and we are becoming more aware of it, we're learning more and more every day about uh the inner life of animals, their emotional needs, especially certain higher mammals, for example, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's as we learn more, I think we will hopefully we will begin to recognize their intrinsic value and their uh, their and their needs, and how they are we are always already intertwined with them in various ways. So of course it's in our interest to act and to act vigorously to mitigate the crisis. But the fact is that, we talk about it, we talk and talk about the crisis, but we're not doing anything really, not nearly enough.
Uh,
And I'm sometimes, at any rate, I don't want to go on a digression, but it's but I think part of the reason is that we are still locked, I think, in a way of thinking about nature that is where we are in some ways outside of it, standing outside.
so that's the problem, and that is the problem. We're not looking.
And we look upon the world as a collection of resources.
Yeah, yeah. So,
It could
so
be
right. So we are not thinking of ourselves as being integral part of nature and what's happening in nature is affecting us, and vice versa. And that is the bigger problem. So you describe, your philosophy, the philosophy of nature, not
yeah,
one of environmental. So that is really what we're talking about here. That is,
yes,
which is very very important. And so
exactly.
what you're saying, most environmental database focus on the climate change or emission or conservation. So if the real problem lies in your philosophy of nature, you've suggested that there are those database is missing something. What is missing?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned this. As I said, obviously the book is subtitled, Toward a Relational Philosophy of Nature, and that's exactly what I'm doing. It rather than environmental ethics as such, and the distinction matters because I don't think the environmental crisis. This is my point, I guess, is that I don't think the environmental crisis is fundamentally an ethical failure. I think it's in a sense, a metaphysical one. And in other words, environmental ethics usually asks questions like, what duties do we owe nature, or do animals have rights, and that sort of thing. How should we balance, human interests against ecological concerns? And these are important questions, no doubt, but they all presuppose a more basic picture of reality. And my question is different. What kind of world are we living in? What kind of beings are we? For several centuries, the dominant picture of nature has been profoundly reductionistic. Living beings have increasingly been understood as mechanisms, essentially organisms as machines. I mean, beginning with in the modern era, this began with Descartes and reviewed animals as automata, not even as sentient beings. We now know that that's crazy, but that was his view, and in some way, although we've surpassed that, in some element of it, I think, is still lingering. Living beings, so once you begin with those assumptions, reductionist assumptions about living things, environmental destruction becomes, I think, almost inevitable. If forests, in other words, are fundamentally timber waiting to be harvested, or rivers are water waiting to be extracted, and animals are biological machines, then exploitation doesn't appear as a moral failure. It appears as
Yeah.
good management, right? So that's why I think our ecological crisis begins long before the chainsaw or the oil rig. It begins in the way we imagine reality itself. What we need, therefore, I think, isn't simply a better environmental ethic. We need a different philosophy of nature. And the tradition and thinkers that I draw upon, Goethe, um, uh, Jacob von Uexküll, Schelling, and others, invite us, I think, to see living beings not as isolated mechanisms, but as relational, as expressive, and as self-organizing forms of life, so that organisms do not first exist and then enter into relationships. Rather, they become what they are through relationships. And relation is not an accident added to life. It's one of life's constitutive principles.
So
And
basically, you're saying, we have to consider, we have relations has to be, it comes before individuality. Is that you're saying? That
yes,
is,
that's exactly what I'm saying. I think we once we begin to see nature this way, ethics almost changes by itself. And care no longer appears as an external obligation imposed upon autonomous individuals. It emerges naturally from recognition, from the recognition that we have never been separate from the living world to begin with. Precisely. So the book isn't trying to add another chapter to environmental ethics. It's trying to rethink the philosophical foundations from which environmental ethics grows. So ultimately, I think we will protect the living world only when we cease imagining ourselves as standing outside it, ultimately. And that isn't first a moral discovery. It's an ontological one, I
yeah,
guess
yeah,
is
but
what.
the general notion is that human beings have always used nature
Yeah.
as if it were a tool, an instrument, a means by which enhance or sustain our existence. So how do you reverse that? How do you tell people you have to look at nature in a different way?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Of course, human beings have always used nature, and I get that. I get that response quite a bit. It's, that isn't that just the way, life works and so on. Uh, I don't dispute, of course, that we've always used nature. Every organism depends upon other organisms. A lion eats a zebra or what have you, and we eat plants and animals. The question, I think, isn't whether we participate in whether we participate in nature. It's the question is how, I guess, is what I'm getting at. There's an enormous difference between participation and domination or exploitation. Traditional cultures, for example, often harvested forests while understanding themselves to belong to those forests. Modern industrial society increasingly behaves as though ecosystems exist solely for our purposes. And that's a very different attitude. So the issue isn't use. I guess it would be my response to that. It's relationship.
Mhm. Yeah, so let me just give you take an example of some deforestation, for example. On the one hand, of course, people need for construction, they need a great deal of wood, so there's deforestation, which is legitimate for specific purposes. And the only way you mitigate the deforestation, you're going to have to supplement that. You have to plant new trees. And there is not enough awareness today that deforestation is not being dealt with effectively, because what is doing is destroying the cycle that you're talking about. Not just forest.
Mm.
Forest is a big part,
Sure.
a big
Yeah,
part of
it's a
it.
whole ecosystem. Yeah.
Can you explain that a little bit more? I want you to focus on the cycle. This is in a way it becomes, if it's not, if we only use nature like you're saying before, and we are not doing something corrective measure in order to maintain the balance. That
Well, let me, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, look, it's I mean, part of this there's a whole empirical side to this, which we need to get into moments of that. That would be a big digression, but the there is, I guess what for our purposes, I think what I'm trying to emphasize here in the book is, of course, as I said, that relation obviously comes before individuality, and you know and I think that when we understand that, then we will treat natural living things and natural resources differently. Um, and this we can see this even at in a at a more at the most fundamental level. Think of a newborn child, for example. Nobody becomes a person alone, because before we're independent, we're completely dependent, as you know, right? We learn language from others. We survive because others care for us. Even our immune system develops through interaction with countless organisms. So life isn't something sealed inside an individual. It's something that happens between living beings.
Right.
Modern politics often imagines society, I think, as individuals entering into contracts with one another.
Mm-hmm.
I think nature tells a different story, that relation comes first. Individuality grows out of relationship, not the other way around. I think that's true biologically. I think it's true psychologically, and I think it's true ethically as well. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but given given our time constraint, I think that's um,
Well, one thing is surprising me. You're not, you're not arguing out of guilt. That is, you don't feel. Now, can you explain that? What are you? Why do you
no,
feel that?
yeah,
What?
absolutely. No, and then that's very deliberate. And then and also as I said before, I'm not using moral exhortations or even there's no list of do's and don'ts at the end of the book or anything like that. But no, I don't argue from guilt, and I think that's because I don't think guilt changes people very effectively. People become exhausted, I think, by moral lectures. What changes people, I think, is perception. If someone begins to see a forest differently, not as scenery, not as raw material, but as a living community, right? An ecological community, their behavior may change naturally. So ethics, I suppose, what I'm saying, my hope, my suggestion is that ethics follows vision. The environmental movement has sometimes relied heavily on fear, and we can see where that's gotten us. Fear has its place. Fear it certainly has its place, but wonder also is ultimately perhaps much more powerful. People protect people protect what they love, and they love what they truly see. So yeah, no, I don't I deliberately avoid that kind of that
So,
sort of.
if someone is listening to you and they want to take you seriously, how should they deal? How do they should be viewing the animals? How they should think about animals? What
Yeah.
should change in their mindset to look at the animals somewhat differently? They didn't hear you before, now they heard you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely. Very briefly, I think, to put it in a sort of rough and ready version, I think, the I don't simply argue that animals deserve better treatment. Of course, I do believe animals deserve better treatment, but that's not what that's not uh what I'm arguing as such. It's, each species inhabits its own meaningful world. And a hawk, a hawk doesn't experience the sky the way we do. A dog doesn't smell the world the way we do. A bee inhabits an entirely different universe of significance. And again, so to just mention the philosopher and biologist von Uexküll, he called these different worlds Umwelten, right? Each world was each organism inhabited its own Umwelt, its own which literally translates into surrounding world, but it's and in phenomenology it would be called the life world, what Husserl would call the life world. But the point is that once you appreciate, I think once you appreciate that every creature experiences reality differently, a certain humility follows, for one thing, and human beings no longer occupy the center of existence. So, we're participants in an astonishing plurality of living worlds. And that's why I think, humility isn't merely a moral virtue. It's in a sense, an epistemological necessity. Every creature reveals dimensions of reality unavailable to us. And that's why I think the loss of a species, a single species, is in many ways a tragic thing, because it's diminishing the way the world appears. It's diminishing the inwardness or the interiority of the natural world.
Yeah, but there's a culture, people, for generations are growing with a different culture. They do not view it. They don't view relations before individuality. And what is going to take? That is, you are saying, we have to look at the animal kingdom differently than we have, because it's an interdependency, and we have to change course. What is going to take? Because it's a culture, so that
Yeah.
now it's embedded in our system. We don't see it that way. So
No, we
what is
haven't.
going to take? What is
Yeah.
going to take to change to change mindset, to change the narrative? What is going to take from your perspective? I mean,
Well,
obviously, this is essential. That is, our continuing existence, healthy existence, is going to depend on our ability to understand our relation, that we have a relationship with the animal, with any being, all of it, including even insects, anything, the smallest thing that we usually
yeah,
discard
sure.
completely. So
Absolutely.
how do
Insects
we
are
go
very
about how do we go about beginning to understand that the fly has a meaning, and we just
yeah.
not swat a fly only because it is bothering us?
No, the loss of insects is a major ecological crisis in itself. The insect population is plummeting, and but I don't know. I think what to answer your question briefly. There are a couple ways to answer it. I think, there's the empirical side to this, and the various policies we can enact, the various changes we can make. Uh, but again, the reason I wrote the book the way I wrote it, and the position I take, is I think to ultimately to make the change, I think we need to begin to ultimately think differently, and we need we need to be less afraid of theory and less afraid of philosophy. I think let me put it this way. Immanuel Kant had a very wonderful distinction between what he called the private use of reason and the public use of reason. And by the private use of reason, he meant, the application of technical expertise to a specific problem. Like, there's a hole in the ocean and it's, leaking oil. How do we fix it, or something like that? And you apply the technical expertise to solving a particular problem. By the public use of reason, though, he meant something different, and that is asking questions about how we're framing the problem itself. For example, is the way that we're framing the problem part of the problem? And so what I'm trying to get at is that, we, of course, we need the technical know-how, but we also need to engage more in what Kant would have called, I think, the public use of reason, which is to ask more fundamental questions about the assumptions that we're making, the assumptions that we've been making for decades, if not centuries, and a book like this can only, at best, maybe light a match and hope, that shed a little bit of light, but we need a lot more of that sort of thing. And so uh, part of it, I think there's a great deal of resistance to theory, to philosophy of nature, which for many years was like like a bad term. It was denigrated. But I think we need it, and we need a new one. And in my small measure, that's what I've tried to contribute to.
I mean, you're saying, public reasoning versus don't you think it should, again, just for our listeners to understand, it should be the other way around. That is a change of approach, a change of philosophy, change of thinking. It begins with the individual rather than the public. But
Well, it's funny that you put it that you would think you might, but this is the way. Actually, that's the way Kant put it. Actually, it's interestingly enough, that's the private use of reason was the particularly, if the the application of exact precisely as I said, to particular expertise to solving a particular problem, but not asking, the more fundamental questions. And if two people just get together and start talking about the philosophy of nature, then Kant would call that the public use of reason. um so it might sound on the face of it counterintuitive to use the terms that way, but that's how he used them. But the real point is that's I think that's what's missing, to some extent. I think that's part of the problem, is that there is this overwhelming faith that technical know-how will solve this problem. And I don't want to diminish the importance of, obviously, the technical and empirical side of this. I just don't think it's enough. And I don't think it gets to the root of the problem. And that, obviously, and hence the why the return, I think, to and the attempt to reground the philosophy of nature, um, and something that is more holistic, less reductionistic. I have no problem, as the first, with the physical chemical analysis of life. All that is well and good. I just don't think that can also give us a full picture of what a living thing is. I think you have to also step back and look at a living thing. Sometimes the analogy I use is, you can look at a play. You can look at the wing. Go behind and look at the wings of a theatrical production, and see how they put on this spectacle. But you won't understand the spectacle unless you sit back in the audience and watch it. And I think living organisms are much the same way. Of course, we have to understand how they work, so the physical chemical analysis of life is fine, but they are also, in a sense, works of art. And when we begin to see them that way, I think we'll begin to treat them differently. And to understand what they mean, we have to also look at them holistically, look at how they appear. Their appearance matters. Their appearance means something. They appear a particular way for other organisms. So yeah, that's really part of what I'm trying to get at, especially in the
I want
first
to
chapter.
reduce it to something, for a listener who listen to this very fascinating conversation with you. So someone took the book and read it more than once and just fully understand it. What do you think should I learn from it or remember from it? And to what extent any of it can be as an
Yeah. Well, I
individual?
guess if there's one thing, I suppose, I would want, uh, you know, anybody to take away from the book. I guess it's one very simple idea. It's that we are not outside nature. We never were. The environmental crisis isn't happening to us. It's happening within us because we're part of the living world. The future won't be secured by better technology alone. Is really what I've been trying to get at. It's or better laws alone, or better markets alone, for that matter, and it will require a different understanding of ourselves and of living nature. Once we stop imagining humanity as standing above life and begin seeing ourselves as participants within it, I think ethics, politics, and environmental responsibility all start to look different. And that's ultimately what ethical interanimality is trying to show. Not that nature needs us, but that we cannot become fully human except through our relationship with the rest of the living world. I guess
So,
that's what
so the person listening to this is persuaded, and what you would say, what's an individual that has been not persuaded by your argument, as I am, as many others, I'm sure, is listening to this. What can they do as an individual? Can you give us just one or two examples as an individual? What would you
Well,
recommend?
that's the question I get a lot, and that's in a way I've tried to
People
answer
are
that.
going to ask,
Of course,
ask
there's
me
the,
this
well,
question.
this, yeah, no. Look, there are many things we can do as individuals. There are many things that we are doing as individuals, to reduce our carbon
Just wanted
footprint.
to name a few things, more something,
But
because
what I'm trying to get at, I suppose, is the one thing that we're not doing enough of, and I don't, and I really mean this, is thinking. And by that I don't just mean just daydreaming. I mean genuinely thinking, and thinking philosophically, thinking theoretically about the world and about our place in it. And I think that's the one, we're doing a lot of good things, but the one thing that I think we're not doing enough of is perhaps because we for various reasons, there's a resistance, particularly in this country. I think maybe less so in Europe. There's a resistance to theory. There's a certain resistance to philosophy. Our country has a long history of some kind of anti-intellectualism, and maybe it's viewed that way. But I think that's part of the problem. And I think what we need to do more of, in addition to all the empirical things that we're doing, um, is uh, is return to, again, to what Kant would call the public use of reason, and to philosophy. I think philosophy has a great deal to offer right now, and
no,
I
so
think,
yeah.
yeah.
So
Go ahead.
go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
But
Finish your.
that's really what I wanted to say. I think that is what I would. That's that. I think that's the one thing as individuals that we're not doing enough of, um, for various reasons. But I think in many ways it's the one thing that's in many ways the most needful right now. If we're going to ever come to look at the world differently, and we're not going to treat it differently if we don't come to view it in a fundamental way differently.
Well, basically, which is absolutely true, and I live this way, and we think in terms of our existence, our well-being, in terms of, okay, I need to make so much money, I have to have so much this in order to be comfortable, to be to be happy a person. But I'm not thinking, most people do not think in terms of I can be happier, better, more wholesome, more productive, more if I also think beyond what I want, but that I'm part of something bigger, much bigger, and I have to relate to that rather than merely thinking about my individuality or what I just need, because I am missing something that is, I am not relating to the bigger entity of which I am part of. And if I'm not relating to it, then I'm not whole.
Absolutely. Yeah,
That's what-
that's exactly what I'm getting at. Yeah, I couldn't put it
so-
much better myself. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, finally, I got a question I have for you. So, how does this work really change you, Sam? I mean, I known you all your life.
Yeah.
I've
That's for
seen
sure.
you from the time you killed that little bird, 5 years old. So I've seen many changes, but I should also mention, beyond what's impact, I think you know, other than writing, teaching philosophy, but also you have other traits. You're a musician, you're a composer, you're art critics. Do you feel that that experience also impacted your interest in the arts, in music? Do you see any connection, correlation between all of this to create this harmony,
I do. I
harmony
do.
in your mind?
I do. I do. I do. I think there are profound connections between music in particular and philosophy, for example, and as well as art and philosophy. To get into those interconnections would be a bit too much of a digression. But I will say this: I think in the process of writing this book and engaging in the other activities that you mentioned, it's I think it has had an impact on me and because I began wanting to write about or to understand nature, but by the time I finished the book, I think I realized that perhaps the more pressing or task and difficult task was understanding humanity's place within it. And philosophy, again, I'll just say this, philosophy doesn't simply give us new ideas. At its best, it teaches us to see differently. And once we see differently, we begin to live differently. Um, and that's my hope, and that's the upshot of the book ultimately.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much, Sam.
Thank you. Thank you.
I am,
Thank you. Thank you.
so it's a pleasure, double a pleasure. As
Thank you.
I always enjoy these podcasts with all of my guests, but I enjoy this even more so because I love you as much, so much, and I know where you're coming from. It was a great treat for me just to say thank you again, Sam.
Thank
We
you.
should have another conversation some other time. All the
Absolutely.
best to you. Thank you
Okay.
again.
Thank you.
All
Bye.
that. Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this episode on the issues. You can find this podcast on my SoundCloud page, and stay tuned to my social media accounts for the latest analysis and announcements.